On November 15, 2017, Animal Control received a complaint from Mr. Lamb and Michelle Ward that on November 13, 2017, a Weimaraner owned by Alice Hollander of 18 Cornhill Street in Annapolis was at large and approached them in their garage in an aggressive manner of attack. Officer Herbert with the Bite Department attempted to contact Ms. Hollander about the incident and advised, since there was prior history with her dog Jackson, that he would have to come into animal control under public safety investigation. Officer Herbert sent out an animal control field officer to post her property or to impound Jackson. A notice was left on Ms. Hollander's, but she was not home at the time of the visit, to contact Officer Herbert about the incident that was reported. On the same day, Officer Herbert was able to get in touch with Mrs. Hollander about the complaint and advised, due to her prior history of Jackson, 2 warnings that were issued for his aggressive behavior, he would need to come in animal control under public safety investigation. On November 16, 2017, Ms. Hollander brought her dog Jackson into animal control under public safety investigation for the incident that occurred on November 13, 2017. During the investigation, Officer Thomas, then contacted the complainants, Mr. Peter Lamb and Mrs. Michelle Ward, to speak to them about the incident that occurred. I was very familiar with Mr. Lamb and Mrs. Hollander and her dog Jackson. I spoke to Mr. Lamb, and he advised that on November 13, 2017, he was in the process of moving out of his home and moving items from the house to his van, which was parked directly behind his garage.
Sir, and I understand that these witnesses are here, so I realize that the rules of evidence are relaxed, but it seems to me that we're citing testimony of individuals who are present and who have been sworn, so I would object to this characterization of the testimony in this fashion.
No, I understand that, and I appreciate your concerns, and the rules of evidence are in fact lax during these informal hearings. This is just a synopsis we hear from the complainant so that the commission has a flavor and a grasp of what the general course of events are. You certainly have your opportunity to present your case and witnesses and to rebut Officer Thomas.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
He advised that for some time that evening he heard Jackson barking loudly on the street. He explained that he and Michelle entered the garage and started to approach his van. He observed Jackson, a male Weimaraner owned by Ms. Hollander, running up the street unleashed without his owner. Suddenly, Jackson saw him inside of his garage. He turned and lunged at him, growling and snarling and snapping at him. He advised that he had a coat in his hands. He waved it in front of Jackson. Jackson lunged at him. He then kicked at Jackson to create space and keep Jackson from contacting him or Michelle. He then screamed at Jackson, bringing the attention of the owner, Mrs. Hollander, who grabbed her dog by his collar and took him home. Michelle then contacted the police. I spoke to Michelle Ward about the incident via the phone. She advised that what Peter advised was what happened. She advised that the dog was very aggressive. During the investigation, Animal Control had on record 2 warnings that were issued. The first on October 22nd, 2014, for Jackson involved in a bite to Mr. Don Rupert. On September 1st, 2014, at a marina in Annapolis, which is 1 Dock Street in Annapolis. Mr. Rupert was walking up to the harbor master's office. He turned the corner to walk up the steps. The dog and the owner were sitting there on the steps. Mr. Rupert began to back up. The dog jumped up, bit him on his left arm. Mr. Rupert submitted a statement in writing and pictures of his arm, minor wounds, no sutures. Those pictures are in this file that needs to be passed forward so that way you can see them.
Never before, whenever an investigator, that information is completely wrong. Talking about the harbor master, we can call the harbor master. Those people are written.
Second warning, which on September 22nd, 2016, issued to a bite to Mr. Peter Lamb, reported July 18, 2016. The warning letter was issued after review of the incident and discrepancies of the statements. Both dogs were at large. However, it remained on record. Animal Control at the time did advise for affidavits to be filed by both parties. The affidavits were rescinded. Animal Control during the time worked with Mrs. Hollander to make corrections at her property to prevent further incidences, with recommendations made by the agency to keep public safety from further incidences with Mrs. Hollander's dog Jackson. After full review of this case, and with Mrs. Hollander's receiving 2 warnings with recommendations to correct the behavior of the dog, Animal Control on November 27, 2017 issued a dangerous order under Article 12-402, Paragraph 5, without provocation, chasers approaching a person in an attitude of attack of the Anne Arundel County Code and means to protect the public from further incidences with Jackson. An amended order was issued on November 30th and signed due to Mrs. Hollander does not have a backyard or fence to be able to kennel or to fence her backyard. It's a street and alley. I responded to 18 Cornhill Street in Annapolis and conducted an inspection of the property with the conditions imposed. Mrs. Hollander was in full compliance, and Jackson was released.
Okay.
And then Mr. Lamb and Mrs. Ward is actually here. They can give you a little bit more insight in reference to the present incident because they were there.
Okay, the dog was released, obviously, because they're in full compliance?
She's in compliance, yes,
Okay.
at the house.
What is it you're challenging if you are in full compliance?
Well, we're challenging the issue of whether or not he's a dangerous dog, because we don't believe that the facts are accurately portrayed as suggested by the animal control officer, that the dog actually did what he's charged with doing, and we have witnesses to testify as to what actually happened. So we dispute the factual allegations as submitted by the animal control officer. As she obviously was not there. She's relating what Mr. Lamb and what she said happened. My client was there, and she would like to offer testimony that would certainly contradict what transpired. In addition to that, we have affidavits, 14 total, 13 letters, 13 affidavits, another affidavit regarding the dog's propensity for violence, which I think is certainly relevant for you to consider as well.
Okay. I just want to be clear that
Yes, sir.
you're not trying to get any particular clause waived under the dangerous order. You want the entire order
That's correct.
to go away. Okay.
That's correct.
Just want to make sure. Thank you.
Officer Thomas, it's my understanding in the warning letters, there were actually 2 human bites, one to a Mr. Don Whippert in September of 14, and then a second one in September of 16 to Mr. Lambert, the complainant?
Mr. Lamb, correct.
Yeah, thank you. Okay.
Here, you can testify.
Okay. I'll try not to be overly redundant, but I want you to hear it in my own words. The evening of November 13th, which is a Monday, Peter and I were moving the last items from our prior home, 26 Cornhill Street, to my home at 179 South Southwood Street. Cornhill Street, his house is on Cornhill Street. The garage is behind the house and then backs up onto Fleet Street. Similarly, the residence on 18 Cornhill Street fronts on Cornhill and has a rear access onto Fleet Street. We had put the last items into the 2 cars that were in the garage, and in the garage opened the garage door with the garage door opener so that the garage door started to raise. We had stopped adjacent to the passenger side door of my car, which is in the easternmost garage bay of the 2-car garage. And we're standing there discussing which errands needed to still happen that evening. When we saw Jackson, the 75-pound Weimaraner owned by Miss Hollander, starting to run up Fleet Street, so from east to west. That's a distance of probably 50 feet or so, 3 houses away from the 26 Cornhill garage. He was unleashed, no muzzle, no owner in adjacency to him. He must have caught sight of us in the garage outside in the door because he executed approximately a 120-degree turn to the left. So reversed course and came into the garage where we were standing. We were adjacent to the passenger side, so at least 6 or 7 feet inside the garage at that point. He lunged at us. He showed his teeth, baring pulling his lips up, lunging at us, barking, snarling, every evidence of attack. I literally felt afraid for my life. I had seen previous damage that the dog had done with 1 bite to Peter's arm. This dog is half my size, very much larger presence relative to me. I was screaming, "No, Jackson." Peter kicked out with his 1 foot and held the coat in his that he was holding in his arms out to create a barrier and provide something else for the dog to bite other than either of the 2 of us. The screams attracted his owner, who came and grabbed him by the collar and dragged him down the street to her house. I pursued them, screaming at her, "Allie, no, this is not acceptable," down the street. I then called 911. I'm not sure what his title is. Officer Artigas came, advised us to report the incident to animal control the next morning, which we did. He knocked on the door, and although Mrs. Hollander was home, she would not respond to him at the time. The next morning, I contacted Animal Control, submitted my affidavit, and we're here today. No, you tell them.
Pretty much, I mean, Michelle said everything that I experienced, except that obviously I'd had previous experience with this dog, and there is absolutely no question in my mind that he was headed for my throat.
What time of day did this occur?
This was at 9:15 in the
9:15
In the
evening.
evening, so it was dark outside?
It was dark.
It was dark. There was no one,
It was what?
10:30.
10:30, okay.
it was 9:15.
But obviously, when the garage door opener went up, the light went on in the garage, and
Yeah, we can see, the light was
Yes.
on.
If
He
you'd
was
like-
well inside the garage when he lunged at me. As I said, from previous experience, I knew I shouldn't protect myself with my arms, so I kicked at him instead, and that seemed to persuade him enough. And then the screaming, and Ally came and grabbed him and dragged him away. So,
If the time is relevant, I'm sure you could verify it with Officer Artigas
Yeah.
or a 911 call.
What exactly, Peter, was your previous experience with Jackson?
I'm sorry, I'm answering Pam's.
we'll get to you. Okay. Any other testimony?
The only other point I would add is that there was no one else other than the two of us in the garage when this event occurred, and no one else on the street.
And no one in the street, correct. So any other witnesses, I don't know
We
where
tried
they
to
could-
find, but no.
Yeah.
Officer Thomas, anything else?
Officer Thomas, with a warning letter in 14 and then an actual human bite in 16, any explanation as to why an administrative order wasn't issued on the second bite?
The reason why on the second bite, like I said in my testimony and stuff, we had a lot of discrepancy stories going on between the two parties.
Okay.
And usually with that happening, I can't necessarily move forward without actually having, the evidence to move forward.
Understand.
So we allowed there to be affidavits filed.
Okay.
Which in turn, they were rescinded. However, the agency, we had a meeting in reference to it. We were trying to help Ally try to maintain the dog on the property without doing a physical order. So, yes, I was to the house several times, advising things that she could possibly do at the property, to correct the problem.
Okay.
Okay, and that's why we issued the warning, because it's a courtesy letter, it's not an
I
administrative
understand.
order.
I understand.
Officer Thomas, can you explain why the warning letters were rescinded and by whom?
Well, the warning letters were never rescinded, okay? It was just the affidavits
Oh.
that were filed for tickets
Okay.
were basically rescinded. I was not privy to what the entirety of why they were rescinded and why they were pulled. The only thing that I could think of is that, Mr. Lamb and Mrs. Hollander was trying to, correct it amongst themselves without moving it forward into the courts.
Okay, thank you.
I just have a couple of questions about that, please. Mr. Lamb, if I could be permitted to question him. Thank
Go
you.
ahead.
Mr. Lamb, you did withdraw the previous affidavit, is that correct, sir?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, and that's the affidavit related to the alleged biting, is that correct, sir?
I don't think there's any question that I was bitten. I withdrew the affidavit that would have gotten Jackson into further trouble.
And so it's clear, and so the Animal Control Commission understands, there have been numerous complaints filed against your animals, isn't that correct, sir?
That's not relevant here.
For bias?
No, that's not relevant. We were discussing this particular case.
Well, I understand that, but he's purporting to suggest a certain set of facts, and I will proffer to you so you know there's litigation between the parties. There are numerous complaints that my client has filed against him as well.
We understand that there's more than likely a history between the two neighbors. We understand that. What we're here specifically to evaluate and make a recommendation on is the matter at hand of Jackson going into the garage of the Lambs.
Well, that's fine, but she was permitted to testify, both women were permitted to testify about prior bite complaints that were never sustained. They were letters, no one ever had any type of administrative hearings. And so essentially, the commission is left with the impression that Jackson has bitten two people on two separate occasions, when we don't believe that that's accurate. And in fact, to the extent that Mr. Lamb previously filed a complaint, he withdrew the affidavits, which certainly suggests that he didn't feel there was enough evidence to go forward. Now, it's suggested...
Which is fine, but complaints against him or his dog are beyond the scope of what we're going to look at today.
So
I
just to
understand
be
where you're going
clear-
with the bias. I understand where you're going with the bias.
Right.
I don't believe it to be relevant to what we're hearing today.
What about the allegations of prior warnings that were then rescinded to the extent that no citations were issued? No.
If they involve Jackson, then yeah, we probably need to hear about those.
Okay. Well, one of those is made by an individual that's not even here. That original complaint is somebody that I believe has not appeared, has not submitted an affidavit, but the dog is being punished for that to the extent that there's an assumption that he did bite someone, and there's photographs to support that without the actual individual being here.
And that's acceptable because, once again, we've got relaxed rules of evidence in these informal hearings.
Right, but there was never an adjudication that in fact that actually happened, just a warning letter. I mean, she, the animal control officer, was not present. That person never appeared, never offered evidence before animal control to support that allegation. Mr. Lamb then makes an allegation and then rescinds the allegation, and yet it's presumed that the dog did do the things that the warning letter suggests. That's my problem with all that.
Okay.
So to the extent that we would have, if we're going to focus on the incident, that's fine, but I just don't want the commission to then suggest that he's guilty of these other acts when it's never been proven that he did it.
Fair enough.
Okay, thank you. So if we can't get into the issues related to prejudice, then I'll just have a couple of questions. Do you have any photographs of the dog on the date of this incident running at large?
No.
Okay. Mr. Lamb, ma'am, do you have any photographs of the dog?
No, I have attested under oath that the dog was running at large. That is my version, what I saw with my own two eyes, and
I
I've
understand
attested
that.
to
I was
under
simply
threat of
asking, do you have
perjury.
photographs? I think the answer is no. Is
No.
that correct? Okay. And do you have anything that would indicate that the dog ripped some piece of clothing, whether it's a jacket or something of that nature, to corroborate any of the testimony that you've given here today?
No, the dog approached me in an attitude of attack. He never bit anything.
Do you have any other neighbors that allegedly witnessed this or overheard this, or other third parties that were present to support these allegations?
No, I've already attested to the fact that there is no other person, including the defendant,
The owner
who
of the
was
dog.
in the garage at the time, who could
From
attest to
from
this in
moment
either
that-
direction.
Thank you. From the moment the dog entered the garage to the time that the owner arrived, what's the time frame between those two events?
Approximately 2.5 to 3 minutes.
And you said that she was not, she just happened to be in the area and just happened to hear the screaming. Is that your testimony?
She heard my screaming. It was quite loud, and she lives 3 houses away.
Okay. So that screaming was loud enough to go from the garage outside into the interior of a home that's 3 homes away from you?
I have no way of understanding
And
where
not a-
Miss
not-
Hollander was.
Not a single other neighbor heard this or was disturbed by this conduct?
Not
Not that you know of?
that I know of.
Okay. Nothing further. Our case?
Yes.
Okay, just to be clear. Ma'am, I'm going to have you, you've already stated your name, you're under the penalties of perjury. I'm going to direct your attention back to the date of this incident. Tell the members of the commission exactly what transpired as it relates to your animal on that date.
It was 10:20 at night, and my dog had to go to the bathroom, so I was walking him outside my house, and I was holding his choke chain, and I was attaching the leash to his collar, but the leash didn't attach. It kind of like, it was malfunctioned. So he ran up the street. I screamed, "Jackson!" They saw him, and they started screaming, and he ran back. And I got a collar, and I got a leash, and walked him back in. It was very quick, very fast.
From the moment that you lost control of the animal to the time that you were able to regain control of the animal, how much time had passed?
Seconds.
When you say seconds, can you define that with some more specific information?
His house is about less than 100 feet away from
His
mine.
house, meaning Mr. Lamb's house?
Mr. Lamb's house is less than 100 feet. So he ran past the house to the little park to relieve himself, and then he ran back. So I would say maybe 40, 50 seconds at most, like 10, 20.
Did you ever
seconds.
witness your animal go into the interior of their garage?
No.
Did you ever witness your animal take some type of an aggressive stance, baring his teeth or doing something that was indicative of the fact that he was taking an aggressive stance towards them?
No.
On any occasion in the past, have you ever witnessed your dog do that with Mr. Lamb or his partner as well?
No.
Now, were you able to regain control of the dog?
He came right back, I put him on the leash and went back in the house.
And did you hear any screams that would be indicative of events that were consistent with what was just testified to?
What was the question?
Sure. There was testimony previously that she was screaming so loud that it was echoing out of or emitting out of the garage down the street 100 feet to your home. Did you hear any screams of that nature?
I just heard bad dog. He was off the leash and he got off the leash.
And who was saying that, if you know?
Peter's girlfriend.
Okay. And that was the sum and substance of what you heard? You have to say yes or no?
Yes.
Okay. Now, did you, in preparation for this hearing, obtain affidavits of individuals that live near you, as well as the vet regarding your dog's propensity for violence or peacefulness?
I've received affidavits from neighbors and from the community.
And did you bring those with you today?
I did.
Okay. Did you put those in a binder?
I did. The last one I got this morning was from a neighbor whose dog plays with mine,
I have about 7 binders that I'd like to offer.
I live downtown Annapolis, and my dog has a very good reputation with everybody, except for Peter. But I think that there is an agenda he has.
When you say there's an agenda, what do you mean by that?
Well, so the first time Peter was allegedly bit, he filed a complaint with Animal Control. Jackson was quarantined. And then Animal Control Officer Thomas told me what I should do is file affidavits every time his dog was off a leash or running at large or barking. So I filed 5 of them. And then, interesting that I filed 5 of them and I get penalized for 2 that were never even investigated and nothing happened with those. But anyway, to get back to it,
That's fine.
so, Peter then left a note on my door, and he said, it was August 2nd, he said, I'd like you to take a look at some paperwork, or I don't know exactly what he wrote, I can't remember. I get nervous talking. So.
Is this a letter that you
Yes.
copy the letter?
Yeah, and my brother.
I'd like to offer this letter. It's signed by Peter, is that correct?
Yeah, so I didn't know about this, but my brother was in litigation with Peter because he has a house next door and he was renovating it, and he wanted me to look over this lawsuit, but also just like talk to him about some pipe or something that they were suing each other about. And then he later said, Allie, I was not severely bit. I'm sorry, you're a good person. I took it out on you because I was upset with your brother. I'm sorry about you and Jackson. Let's just work this out ourselves. So he rescinded it, but I still got a warning. And then this very first one, I don't know where to start with this because, well, I guess that's a separate matter because that's actually ridiculous. But I'm upset that that was used against me because that just did not happen. And
you were present for that particular incident, is that
yeah,
correct?
I was at the harbor master, and Jackson was on this leash that he could not have jumped up. I was sitting there, and the day before, the man was a little eccentric, like he was cursing under his voice, and I was walking Jackson around the harbor master, and he was throwing out a sandwich, and then Jackson took the sandwich that he was throwing out, and he said he was going to the police, so he did. And I went to the police officer and said, yeah, Allie, that guy's crazy.
Objection. The officer's not here.
And then the second day, I was sitting at the harbor master. I was eating something, and Jackson was sitting there, and the same man walked up. And I stood up, and Jackson stood up. And there was a police officer, well, actually, the man stood up, and he started screaming and yelling at me. And, like, the whole thing where he was cursing under his voice, and and then all these people came up to us, and they're like, get away, that guy's crazy. And there was no bite at all. But he did go to an officer and filled out a bite report. And it was interesting, because while he was doing that, I was sitting outside Socorro eating with Jackson, and all the kids from St. Mary's were walking, and they all run up to Jackson, pet him and hug him. And the same man, he had some kind of issues going on because he was doing all these weird things, like acting crazy because he's, I don't know. But the police officer, like, there was no bite on him. He was just his crew. He was at the harbor, and the crew on his boat were just like, that guy's really just a not happy, crazy guy. So I'm just upset that you guys never even looked into it. And when I was telling animal control, they're like, oh, don't worry about it, it's just a warning. I said, well, let me tell you the details. They said, oh, don't worry about it, it's a warning. Well, you know, I really wish you guys would have looked into it.
I'm going to object again, too, because there was a full investigation done and completed, and it's in your files.
Well, we could talk to the people at the harbor master, because they're there, and they were there a few years ago, and to get their
I understand
testimony
that,
as
but
well.
I'm going to object because you're basically saying that, you know, we didn't do anything on
Nobody
our
latched onto
end.
his arm.
And stuff. We
He
had
didn't lunge.
photographs to show and prove that the man was bitten. There was an actual animal bite report that was taken for both parties,
The same
not
man
only
was,
just
like,
Mr.
cursing
Werper,
under
but
his
also
breath.
Mr.
I
Lamb.
went to the
Second
emergency
time.
room.
Correct, and we, you know, even though it wasn't severe and he didn't receive any sutures, it was still a bite, it was still an exposure. Same way with Mr. Rupert, it was very minor, and there's a bite report that was taken for
But that's
both.
not
The
fair
dog was
because-
quarantined for the amount of time it had to be
Both
for 10
Peter and
days.
my
Just so
dogs
I
were off
understand the
the
rules,
leash.
does she get to just advocate and just present her position without anything to support that? I mean, she's an advocate, obviously. She's not present. She doesn't have any personal knowledge. She presented her case. I thought it was my time to present a case. And it sounds like we've switched back to her opportunity to present additional evidence. She can make an objection, but she's not objecting. She's offering testimony.
We'd like to hear both sides, believe me.
And it's,
Right, but it sounds like we're back on
Well, I
her
think,
side.
it's really not fair.
I think what
because
we probably
Peter's
need to do
dog-
here is to stipulate that Jackson, at least it's my understanding, that Jackson, based on the report that Animal Control's done, Jackson's had at least 2 previous bites, one requiring hospitalization for Mr. Lamb.
I'm not stipulating,
no.
hold on. wait.
No,
I'm not
no, that's-
stipulating to that at all.
No, I understand that, but what I'm saying is that's what we seem to be dancing around back and forth.
I agree.
So my comment is,
Peter never went to the hospital, and the affidavits I filled out that Animal Control told me to, it was the day after, the day that he allegedly was bit, and who's to say it was his dog or my dog, because he got in between the 2 dogs. His dog was also off a leash. That night, he was throwing the ball at like 2 o'clock in the morning with his dog, and then the next day. And Peter, you're under oath. You said, my dog, Allie, your dog did not severely bite me, bite you. My dog did not bite him. You said that you took out your anger on Jonathan, who is suing you, and you're upset, you'd have to hire an attorney, and you're upset, what, blah, blah, blah. You specifically said your dog did not severely bite me. Is that correct? Yes or no?
I have photographs of the dog bite, jaw size, that
Peter,
prove without a doubt with the ruler that it was not my dog. So I just want to remove any doubt about that.
Peter said it was a
Secondly,
Bichon.
yeah, I have a Bichon with a mouth about that big. Secondly, it was the emergency room that filed the original. I did not file anything against Ally. It wasn't my option whether to do something or not. The emergency room does it automatically.
yes.
So I'd like to go back to the evening for this dangerous order of November 2017. There's discrepancy.